Jekyll Island, Georgia. You've probably seen it going down I-95. It's a vacation playground with shopping, hotels, restaurants, beaches, camping, and a strange past indeed. The Timucua Indians lived in North Florida and some parts of southern Georgia. Jekyll Island was one of those places they inhabited. In the early 1500s, Spanish explorers were shocked at the size of the Timucua. They were well built and standing 4 to 6 inches or more above all the explorers. Perhaps adding to their perceived height was that the men were wearing their hair in a bun on top of their heads. Moreover, the women were about 2 to 4 inches taller than most of the explorers. One of the strange things about Timucuans is that they practice several forms of blood sacrifice, including human sacrifice. The Timucuan may have sacrificed their firstborn. According to Jacques Lemoyne, who witnessed the ceremony and made a watercolor illustration, the firstborn son was sacrificed to the tribal chief. It is carried out by the mother and her female relatives. A tree stump about 2 feet high and about 2 feet wide was used as the altar. The mother would squat in front of the altar and start weeping. The female relatives would dance about and rejoice. Whoever was holding the child danced in the center and sang praises to the chief. Meanwhile, 6 other Indian men would stand to the side. One of the 6 was a sacrificing officer, and he was heavily decorated. The ceremony is ending when the officer steps to the altar, holds a club, and sacrifices the child. You get what happens next. Jekyll Island is no stranger to slavery. Congress prohibited the transatlantic slave trade in 1807, but the underground slave trade continued until close to the start of the Civil War. The United States made little effort to enforce their legislation until about 1820 to 1821 or so. That's when the U.S. naval ships patrolled the western African coast. Some wanted the slave trade to continue as a way to keep the price of slaves down. Charles Lamar was a big proponent of slavery. He and William Corey bought a luxury pleasure schooner. It was called the Wanderer, and it was retrofitted to hold captives. They had installed a hidden deck and a 15,000-gallon fresh water tank. In July 1858, the ship left port while flying the pennant of the New York Yacht Club, where Corey was a member. When the Wanderer stopped in Charleston, South Carolina on its way to Africa, its mission was so well known it was greeted with a cannon salute. The crew sailed to the west coast of Africa, where they purchased 480 slaves. Most of them were teenage boys. Many of the enslaved were caught by the Dahomey, a highly militaristic society that would engage in wars and raids against its neighboring nations, and sold captives into the Atlantic slave trade in exchange for European goods such as rifles, gunpowder, fabrics, cowrie shells, tobacco, pipes, and alcohol. They would lure their subjects with sweets and red cloth, which meant a sign of work. Some of them they just kidnapped outright. The food that the slaves ate on board this ship was a mush of cow peas or corn. They had to relieve themselves where they lay, for there was no privy for the captives. Sickness was rampant. During the 6-week journey, some 80 or so Africans died. As they expired, their bodies were thrown overboard. When they arrived on Jekyll Island, Georgia, about 409 made it. Arrangements had been made by the Du Bignon family. Lamar had neglected to hire a local pilot for the crew, and Corey had to go to shore and hire one and disclose the crew's plans. After unloading was complete, Lamar and his business associates were alerted and traveled to Jekyll Island on a chartered tugboat. About 300 of the Africans were taken and held at the plantation of Montmilion in South Carolina. Others were distributed to the investors. It was impossible to keep this many slaves just showing up from Africa to the slave markets quiet. Corey, Lamar, and others involved in the scheme were soon arrested and tried in federal court in Savannah. However, a jury of mostly Southern men would never convict them. Lamar was a ruthless character and may have threatened the jurors. One of the judges in the case was actually Lamar's father-in-law, John Nicole.
Isn't this a conflict of interest, Detective?
That would be a conflict of interest.
That's a conflict of interest.
The Wanderer was then put up for auction. Lamar somehow was able to bid on the boat and won.
Are you kidding me?
In May 1861, the federal government seized the Wanderer as an enemy vessel and used it in blockades of the Confederate ports. The ship eventually sank off the Cuban coast in 1871. John Furman was the captain of the Wanderer, and he was indicted with the others in Savannah. He is said to have highly regretted this episode in his life. Furman went on to become a colonel and a brigadier general in the Union Army. Lamar organized the 7th Georgia Battalion and later served at the Battle of Columbus. He was the last officer to be killed in the Civil War. One of the slaves that was captured was known as Ward Lee. Just 5 years after his arrival in the U.S., Lee was freed, but he remained stranded in a foreign country. Years later, he penned a public letter seeking help to return to Africa. It read, "I am bound for my old home if God be with me." Lee was never able to return to his home. Well, the last known slave ship to arrive in the U.S. was called the Clotilda. Well, Jekyll Island was no stranger to finance. At the turn of the century, the banks were fragmented at best. If a bank wanted to issue some notes, it had to purchase the bonds, deposit these bonds in the U.S. Treasury, wait for the Treasury to print the notes, and then wait for the notes to be printed and shipped. This took about 3 weeks. It was not an efficient way to get people their money. The banking system had about 27,000 small town banks that all were connected to larger bank systems. Well, anyway, in 1907, there was a major panic. There was a run on the Knickerbocker Trust Company, and it spread to other New York City trusts as well. J.P. Morgan became concerned, so he wanted to find out how to stop this. He hired Henry Davidson and Benjamin Strong to check into this. These two could not assure Morgan that the Knickerbocker was sound or it was even going to last, and sure enough, it failed. Well, something had to be done. On November 1910, Republican Senator Nelson Aldrich got together a team of people to solve this problem. It was himself, P. Andrew, who is the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Davidson, who was a partner with J.P. Morgan, Frank Vanderlip, who was the president of the National City Bank, Benjamin Strong, who was the vice president of Bankers Trust, and Paul Warburg, who was the board member of Wells Fargo. They all met at Jekyll Island. Now here's how it happened. Aldrich chose the attendees because of their expertise. He knew that their ties with Wall Street would arouse suspicion, so they were kept under secrecy. He created a cover story of a duck hunting trip and a Thanksgiving dinner, instructed each man to come in one at a time on a train terminal in New Jersey. That's when they would board Aldrich's private train car. So, a member of the exclusive Jekyll Island Club, which is probably J.P. Morgan, had arranged the group to use the club's facilities. The club members included J.P. Morgan himself, Marshall Fields, William Vanderbilt, and many others. Along the island, they had mansion-sized cottages that dotted the whole place. This club was the richest, most exclusive, and most inaccessible club in the world. But they were not there to ride bikes, duck hunt, or go golfing. Their purpose was to save the banking system. It was a closely guarded secret for 2 decades, and the men did not admit that the meeting ever happened until the 1930s. Well, after a few days, they had a rough draft which became the Aldrich Bill. The plan that these men made on Jekyll Island laid the foundation of what would eventually become the Federal Reserve System as we know it today. Now the banking system was centralized. Visiting Jekyll Island today, you would not realize its past. Bizarre sacrifice, unwanted capture, and financial stability. That is strange indeed. Well, thanks for watching. We'll keep the videos coming here on Strange History. Hey, check out the video on the assassination of one of the greatest presidents in American history, Abraham Lincoln.